Shavua Tov, everybody. I hope this video finds you well in the midst of this pandemic. It sure is turning out to be an interesting Pesach this year. I mean, what's the irony that we all have to stay in home to, be safe from a worldwide plague? All right? Interesting times we live in. So many of us find ourselves in a situation where it's not going to be the easiest to go get boxes of matzot, or maybe it'll be out already in a lot of stores. So after discussing with Rabbi Kligfeld, we thought it would best to provide detailed and accurate information so that if you decided to, you could bake matzah in your home for Pesach. Now, I know there are a lot of concerns that people have and a lot of halachic questions that people have. So this is going to be the first part in a multi-part series on how to bake matzot in your home as easily and as halachically acceptably as possible. And this first video is really just going to dig into a lot of the misconceptions people have about baking matzah, about the rules of how to bake matzah, and just give you really the nuts and bolts and what you need to do in order to be doing this comfortably and have almost no risk of making hametz as a part of this process. So the first question that I'm usually asked is, how do you do it all in 18 minutes, once the water hits the flour? The reality is that whoever told you that was lying to you. There is no halacha from any great source about 18 minutes from the moment the water hits the flour. What is the halacha, however, is once you are done kneading the dough, you have 18 minutes before you put it in, before you start cooking it. And whatever that cooking is can mean very different things. Can't mean anything, but it can mean very different things. So for companies that have been making soft-matzah, they usually use an overturned wok, which in Arabic they call a saj, or they use a tabun or a tanur, which is a clay oven, and you kind of slap the bread against the wall. So in Hebrew, the original word for oven is tanur, and it was this clay oven, and it's also a very similar word for tandoor, which is still the same type of oven. So the more you know. So the first thing is, yes, you have 18 minutes from the moment you're done kneading the dough. Now, doesn't that seem like a much more reasonable expectation? You can knead the dough as long as you want. You can do it in 5 minutes. You can do it in 50 minutes. You can do it in 2 hours. You can do it all day. The halacha, according to the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam, is that you can knead the dough all day and it will never become hametz. And in actuality, the kasher lefesach matzot that you buy that just say kasher lefesach, they are actually in these big machines and in these big tubs. And the machines move the dough all day long and it never becomes hametz. So that's the biggest question I have, number one. Number two, there's lots of questions about the type of flour that's used, and people want shmura flour to make their shmura matzah. So historically, there is a debate in the Talmud about what type of flour you really need to bake matzot, because there is a verse in the Torah that says that you shall guard these matzot. And the question is, what does this guarding mean? So the Gemara does not really fully resolve the three opinions that are there. So there are basically three halachot that are on the books regarding what this shmura, what this guarding is. So the most stringent opinion is that the wheat itself is guarded from the moment that it is cut. And that means that, once it's cut, we don't wait we don't leave it there, and go on with, the rest of the harvest or anything else we have to do, because there's a worry that maybe rain will come and fall on the stalks. So shmura from harvest means that from the moment it's cut, it is immediately packed away and watched, and from that moment on, they make sure that no water comes into contact with it from that moment. That is the most stringent opinion. It is also the only opinion of the Rambam. So Yemenites are of the opinion that if you can't get this level of shmura flour, then you don't say certain berachot during the Seder. You don't say certain berachot when you are making the matzah, because that's the only opinion brought down in the Rambam. It must be guarded from the moment of harvest. The Shulchan Aruch actually brings down three opinions, and it's the Shulchan Aruch, so it's It gives you these three so that you could use all three depending on the situation you find yourself in. So we already covered the most stringent opinion, which is from the moment of harvest. The second most stringent opinion, and the opinion that I follow whenever I'm baking matzot for the community or for sale, is shmura, or guarding from the time of grinding. So that means you've already done some of the harvest, you've separated out the different parts of the stalk, and you have the wheat berries. And shmura from grinding means that from the moment you grind the wheat berries into flour, you make sure that there's no contact with water. So we have a wheat grinder. It's a completely dry process, and we get the flour and we put it in a airtight and liquid-tight bucket until we're ready to bake with it. That is the practice that we use when the world isn't ending in a global pandemic. So this is still technically shmura. It's just guarding. It's just from a different time. You're just starting from a different time in the process. The third opinion in the Shulchan Aruch, which will definitely apply to almost all of us right now, is that you can use normal flour min hashuk from the market. Now, some people will have heard that, oh my goodness, but flour from the market is tempered, and that means that the big companies, they add water to the wheat berries, or they boil them, and all these kinds of things, and therefore you can't use it. So I'm going to give you some historical background about this. Historically, everybody tempered wheat berries. Everybody did it. And they did it in much more extreme ways. The Talmud even talks about boiling the wheat berries. Why? Because grinding these things is hard. I actually had someone reach out to me, and they said they wanted to do what I had done, which was get the wheat berries and grind them. And they mentioned that they bought a coffee grinder, and I said I didn't think that was going to work because these wheat berries are very hard. And this person seemed fairly certain that the coffee grinder would work. And the wheat berries broke the coffee grinder. Grinding wheat is a very, very, very tough process. And even the Shulchan Aruch talks about how you can't even freshly grind the flour and then immediately make matzah because the flour is so hot because of all the friction. And even in my wheat grinder, the flour comes out hot because of all the friction that it takes to really grind it down. So everybody used to temper wheat berries by either soaking them or by putting them in boiling water. So, and the children of Israel also did this up until, I think, close to the end of the closing of the Gemara. The Rambam speaks about how no one tempers, no one adds the wheat berries to boiling water anymore. It's just people have forgotten how to do it properly. I'm not here to argue whether you could have forgotten such a process. I'm just highlighting that people actually did this in a very extreme way. And I actually read from an article published by the OU, oddly enough, that talks about the current tempering process. The current tempering process is they have the wheat berries in these huge silos, and they actually just increase the humidity of the silo. To the point that there is no actual water droplets on any of the wheat berries. So it would just be like they're in a humid room. Does that make them hametz? I don't know. But either way, historically, everybody has been, since before the Mishnah, before the Gemara, into the dark times of history, people have been tempering wheat in much more extreme ways. And that means that when the Shulchan Aruch talks about buying flour from the market, he knows that that flour from that market is going to be tempered. And he also knows that it's going to be tempered in a worse way, or in a much more extreme way, than our current manufacturing processes temper things. So if anything, I would say, as a non-rabbi, but as someone who has been studying this and speaking to people in the industry, if anything, I think the flour now might be safer than the flour in the normal markets of the Shulchan Aruch. Having said that, the Shulchan Aruch does say, buy flour from the market. I think the Shulchan Aruch was written so that way, if you found yourself in a situation where you couldn't do the best or the most stringent opinion, it gave you the opinion that you could always rely on. And you can rely on the Shulchan Aruch. You can use flour from the market. Having said that, Rabbi Klickfeld and I had a discussion, and we are recommending that people only buy a new bag of flour. Do not use old flour for this process. That is a safety measure that we think makes good sense because you were not as careful during the rest of the year. And you might have had like some wet hands, and you put the measuring cup in to get more flour out. So if you are going to plan to make your own matzah, please use a new bag of flour. If you're not sure that a new bag of flour from the market is kasher enough for you, you can contact your local bakeries, and some of them sell very fresh ground flour. And if they've ground it themselves, I can almost guarantee you that the wheat berries are not tempered. I've reached out to 4 separate companies that sell whole wheat berries, and they say that if you buy the berry directly, they are never tempered. And they said that that's pretty common practice. So if you are able to buy flour from a local bakery that has ground it themselves, it is very, very likely that it has not been tempered. And then you would fall into the shmura from grinding opinion, which is where we usually like to rely. The next question is the water. The Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam and the halachot in general speak about water, and that you can't use hot water to bake your matzah. That you can't use it to knead your dough. It also recommends that you use something called rested water. There's a lot of ink as to what this rested water might mean. Without going into all the nuts and bolts, I can tell you that most matzot factories just get water from the tap and store it in big jugs or big stainless steel things, and they rest it for a day, and then they use that water to bake the matzah. I've heard people talking about, if the point is you don't want to use hot water, then maybe you use cold water, and they'll actually put the water in the fridge. I definitely don't recommend doing that. The dough is not going to knead well. Third question, what is in matzah? Flour and water, that's it. The Shulchan Aruch says to not add salt. The Rambam says you can definitely add salt, and even for the night of the first Seder, I believe. I might not be so accurate about that, but generally the Rambam says you can definitely add salt. But what the Rambam does not allow is he does not allow you to add other spices for the matzot that you are baking for the Seder, because it's supposed to be poor man's bread, lehem ani. But the Shulchan Aruch rules that there is a practice to not put salt in the matzah. And he thinks this is the right practice. I'll leave it up to you. Yemenites do add salt to their matzah. For my personal self, I do add salt to my matzah, and I find that it makes the bread last a little bit longer because salt is always a preservative as well. But you don't have to. And again, most matzot that you buy do not have any salt. And that is the common practice for Ashkenazim and Sephardim, to not add salt. Let's see. Don't knead in the sun and don't knead right next to the oven, if possible. Again, we're concerned about heat. All right. The next questions will deal with what kind of equipment do you need? The answer is you don't really need any equipment. I know there are some crazy matzah videos and some crazy propaganda about these huge factories and these ovens that get 1,000 degrees and the matzot come out burnt and smoking and all sorts of stuff. There's no halachot on how hot your oven needs to be. There's no halachot on how long it needs to cook. There's no halachot on what devices you need to use or what types of oven you need to use. The Shulchan Aruch talks about throwing the dough literally on the coals of the fire. It also literally talks about using a clay shard that was a piece of a roof. The only thing the Shulchan Aruch requires of you is that whatever you're cooking it in already be hot. So when you're baking matzah, what you're concerned about is you want to make sure that the matzah cooks evenly. And by that I mean, let's take a step back. Matzot, most people don't realize this, can be up to a tefah thick. Now how big is a tefah? A tefah is a handbreadth. Matzot can be this thick. And in fact, I believe the showbread in the temple was matzot, and I believe it was a tefah thick. So, historically, there was a lot of concern of if you make the matzot this thick, you want to make sure that it cooks all the way through. And there was a risk of like you could cook the outside, but the inside might be raw, and that would definitely be hametz. And the halachot talk about if you see it like bubbling up from the center, that would be an instance of the center is not really cooking and it's actually just rising and becoming hametz. That was a big problem. Ashkenazim thought that this was talking about air bubbles. It's not. So number one. So whatever cooking surface or oven you're going to use, make sure it's hot. Number one. Number two, you can make the matzot as thick as your oven allows you to make, or your cooking surface allows you to make, whatever you can cook through efficiently. How you can tell your matzah is done cooking is when you rip it, there is no wet threads that's trying to hold the dough together. Or if you read our friend the Mishnah Berurah, if you take a toothpick and stick it through and nothing sticks to it, which also gives you a bit of insight into what kind of matzah he is eating. You can make it on a saj. You can make it on a frying pan. You can make it on a cast iron skillet. You can make it on a pizza stone inside of your normal oven. You can make it on an overturned wok. You could also make it on a baking sheet in your oven. But depending on whatever way you use to bake it will partly determine how your matzot will come out. If you roll out very thin matzot and then you put them in a typical box oven that we as Americans have, it might get dried out and come out very crunchy. If you cook it on a cast iron skillet, it will come out much more like pita or lafa. And the only other things that you need to be careful about is you don't want to mix oil with water. So you're going to be kneading the matzah with water. You don't want to put oil on your baking sheet, and you don't want to put oil on your cast iron skillet or on your pizza stone or however it is you're going to be baking the matzot. If you mix oil with water as part of this process, it is considered that whatever you have made has become hametz. So this will be a water-only process. So if you have a non-stick thing, that's also great. If you don't have a non-stick thing and you're worried about your dough sticking, once you've rolled it out, you can actually just get some more water and add it to the matzah and like just add it to the topmost surface, and that will help make it non-stick for the purposes of cooking. And the last recommendation I have for this first video is if you're going to go through this endeavor, I recommend that you have 2 people as a part of this process. We talked about earlier on that once you start kneading the matzah or the dough, it can never become hametz. So the safest practice is to have one person constantly kneading the dough, while another person will take a chunk off of that dough and roll it out and cook it. And so the first person is constantly kneading, and that dough will never become hametz. And the person who's rolling it out and baking it will be baking things very efficiently, and no hametz will ever be made. So if you have this 2-person process, it would be very nearly impossible to make hametz as part of this matzot project. For more in-depth questions, I will actually be posting the relevant laws of matzot in English and in Hebrew, and you'll find them below in the YouTube description area. And again, there will be more videos to come, including how to bake matzah and some of the questions people have about whether you need to add holes and how you do a bunch of things and much more technical questions. But this was, again, just a video to answer some of the big halachic questions people have. And if you have any specific questions, feel free to email me or to comment to this video. Thank you so much.